Okay. Hey, everybody. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books here in Tulsa, Oklahoma on a hot June day. And I'm so thrilled that you can be with us. This is our ongoing virtual author event series, which we have been doing for over about 14 months or so now. And we're kind of inching our way towards our 200 events, I think, in the next couple of months with virtual events at least. And really looking forward to getting back to some in-person things this summer, but it really has been a great way to stay connected with all of you and meet lots of new friends and talk to some old friends and reach new people across state lines and borders and across the ocean and all over the world. So this has been one of the pluses of this digital world. Imagine if this pandemic had happened to us in 2005, what kind of world would be living in? We wouldn't be as connected as we are now. So it's, I think, easy to take these things for granted, but it's been such a great tool for us to stay tethered to our audience in some way. And if you're not familiar with us or what we do, thank you for joining as well. Really excited about tonight's event. Before I get into that, I will tell you that we do have a lot of stuff coming up the next couple of months. I won't go through that full list, but I would encourage you to go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and you can see the full schedule of all the upcoming programs there. Quite a range of things, and you can sign up for what you want there and see. Some things are ticketed, some are not, and just see what's coming up. When we were doing real events, in-person human being events, we would rotate around town, and there were so many different venues around town that we would use. And one of my favorite spots is a little place called the IDL Ballroom, and it's a kind of a music venue, nightclub / place. We've done all kinds of things there over the years. I've had everybody from the great singer-songwriter Jimmy Webb to Carmen Maria Machado to all kinds of people. And one of my favorite events that we have ever had there was with Kate Moore, and she was joining us for her first time here in Oklahoma, all the way from the UK, for her wonderful book, The Radium Girls, which I'm sure many of you have read and are familiar with. Maybe you've even seen the film. I mean, there's all kinds of things that have happened since we last spoke. But we had a really wonderful night, kind of a standing room only, packed house, and had a great conversation about that book. And so when we saw that there was an opportunity, and of course saw that there was a new book coming, we were just excited about that. But when we had the great opportunity to speak with Kate again, albeit in a virtual setting, we certainly didn't want to pass up that opportunity. And tonight we're going to be talking about Kate's new book, The Woman They Could Not Silence: One Woman, Her Incredible Fight for Freedom, and the Men Who Tried to Make Her Disappear. A lot to talk about, and I want to begin by saying a huge thank you and welcome to our friend Kate Moore. Welcome back virtually to Tulsa, Kate.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be joining you again. As you say, we had such a wonderful night last time that it's a pleasure to see you again, Jeff, and to be chatting with you.
Great to see you. And thank you, again, it's 1 o'clock in the morning over there in the UK, and thank you for staying up with us. I hope you have, some snacks or something to drink.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
So I guess I'd like to begin. I think so many people became familiar with your work with the Radium Girls. That was such kind of a global phenomenon and really took off in ways that I'm sure surprised you and the publisher and everybody else.
Yeah.
And that was an opportunity, of course, to tell this story about this group of women. And you of course, highlight certain figures, but it really kind of was this collective story about how an industry impacted these people. Obviously, you narrow your focus in the new book, where you kind of tell us the story of this one woman who's, although her life represents the struggles of so many. Begin by telling us, who was Elizabeth Packard? Introduce us to this woman and where we were, and kind of set the scene for us.
Yes, well, the woman they could not silence is Elizabeth Packard, and I suspect most people listening and watching have never heard her name before because her legacy has been forgotten, but she did leave an amazing legacy. Now, Elizabeth, to set the scene, was a 43-year-old housewife and mother of 6. That's who she is and what her world involves as the book opens. And it opens on June 18th, 1860, so on the cusp of the American Civil War. And her story starts with a very simple question that will probably get people's brains thinking about what this story is, and hopefully start to enrage a few people. And I think it is a book to enrage and to get you fired up. because the story starts with a simple question. What would happen if your husband could commit you to an insane asylum just because you disagreed with him?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a big question. And I think that I certainly had not heard of her before, which, like, is not a novel, thing. I think that was some of the point here. But I certainly had heard about hysteria, and I had heard about the kind of cavalier nature people were using when they were, institutionalizing women at a pace that it's mind blowing. And basically the idea that, women, even looking at the laws at that time, were basically property of their husbands. They owned no property, all these different things, which kind of leads to this, in some ways, kind of an indentured servitude that allows someone to do this. So talk about how common was that at that time, and was it prevalent specifically then? Was that a high point for it? And did it, when had it been going on for quite some time?
Yeah, well, as you say, it's so much to unpack there. So yes, this was common, and actually it's something that Elizabeth realizes as she is sent to the asylum, because as she walks onto the 7th ward, which is where she's sent in the Illinois State Hospital, she meets so many other women who to her also seem sane, and she talks to them, and yet again many of them have been sent away by domineering husbands, by their fathers, because the fact was a woman could be locked up by the request of her husband or her father, and specifically without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. That was literally in black and white in the law. And the received scientific and medical wisdom of the age was that a woman like Elizabeth, who was assertive, who stood up to her husband, who insisted on her right to hold her own opinions and to think in her own rights, she was actually a textbook example of female insanity in the age. It was something called moral insanity, which was a term and a diagnosis that had been invented in 1835, so about 25 years before Elizabeth is institutionalized. And the definition of moral insanity was eccentricity of conduct. But if you think about what eccentricity of conduct is, well, it's a bit like beauty. It's all in the eye of the beholder. Who is making that definition? In Elizabeth's case, it was deemed eccentric and insane for her to be assertive, to stand up to her husband. In other women's cases, the fact that they were ambitious was seen as eccentric. Some of the doctor's case notes that I read as part of my research criticized those women who wanted to go off and become nurses in hospitals because they weren't just being satisfied with that role of wife and mother in the home. This was deemed eccentric and therefore insane. And it applied to any woman who used her brain, who studied, who read. I looked up the records of the Illinois State Hospital. They very helpfully used to publish a biennial report. So every 2 years, there's this massive historical data, which is such a gift for a researcher. And it had listed the causes of insanity in the patients that Elizabeth is committed alongside. And novel reading is one of the causes that is listed. And the theory ran, as I say, that any woman who wanted to do something beyond the domestic sphere, that was seen as unfeminine, unnatural, therefore sick. But also the fact that a woman could use her brain was seen as very dangerous, almost biologically. She was meant to focus on, her sexual organs, on giving birth to children. If she used her brain, that would mean, as a doctor defined it, a brain of limited capacity to comprehend subjects was being utilized, and that could lead to mental breakdown. And I think, just to finish this point, one of my the quotes that I was perhaps most shocked by was of a doctor who went to visit an all-girls high school in 1858, 2 years before Elizabeth is institutionalized. And he says to the teachers, "You're training your girls for the lunatic asylum," because the idea that a woman could receive an education was deemed risky and dangerous to her mental health.
So we've laid out a little bit of the starting point here for everybody who's watching. I, of course, want to encourage you guys to ask questions while we go. Put those into the Q&A, and I'll pass some of those along to Kate. And of course, if you would like to get a copy of this book, which I would certainly encourage you to do, we're going to make that really easy for you. We'll put links as we keep talking here in the chat, and you can just click on that and get it directly from us. So I'm curious, the institution in Illinois, does that still exist? And did you get a chance to ever visit it?
I did go on a physical research trip to America to visit the hospital, yes. So, you know, like Elizabeth, I walked past the stone gateposts that are still standing. The stone's really crumbly and old. They're twice the height of a woman. There's a real sense of sort of crossing over. And I know, you know, you could just imagine how it would be for Elizabeth to go past those gateposts, to leave, you know, the freedom of the world behind and cross over that border. Now, I crossed over that border into what is now a community park. There are lots of the auxiliary buildings still standing, but unfortunately for me, the main building in which Elizabeth was held was knocked down in 1984. So I was too late to actually see it myself. But I did interview some of the local people who remembered breaking in as teenagers. You know, they sort of told me tales of breaking in the dead of night and, you know, traversing these long hospital corridors of this abandoned mental hospital, you know, traversing them by flashlight, digging out the secrets of the insane asylum. And I was really struck in my research that when they did knock the hospital down, they actually kept the limestone windowsills, because over the years, patients had etched messages into them, words and pictures, and they were deemed of such historical importance that they were actually kept when the hospital was knocked down. But unfortunately for me, I couldn't actually go into the building where Elizabeth was held. I did manage to go to the church where her husband had preached. So that was part of the research trip, to go to those places that she had been, that she had lived. But sadly, the hospital wasn't a place I could walk inside.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up her husband, who was a preacher. Let's introduce him a little bit and talk about, we've already mentioned that she was institutionalized. Why was she, in the eyes of him at least? What was the reasoning given, and how did that even come to pass?
Well, her husband was quite a man. And again, fortunately for me as a researcher and someone trying to write a narrative nonfiction book, you know, I think that's a really important to make, actually, is that this is a history book and it is nonfiction. But anyone who's read the Radium Girls will know that above all else, I'm a storyteller. And if you read this book, hopefully, you know, these people from history almost read as, you know, vibrant characters. Hopefully I've brought them to life, and I take the reader on a sort of page turning journey through this twists and turns of this dramatic story. And a gift for me is that Theophilus, her husband, left behind his diary and his memoir. So as well as being able to draw on Elizabeth's writings, which also survived, I had the other side of the story as well. So to answer your question, Theophilus was a man who was very set in his ways, very gloomy, very dull, you know, anticipates his death every second day. And I think, you know, the first problem between them is that they had completely opposite characters. You know, he was this very gloomy man. He was 15 years Elizabeth's senior. And she was a very vibrant, curious person. She outshone him in every single regard, and he felt that as well. And Elizabeth was aware of it. And the sort of splits in their marriage began as women's rights began to, you know, take dominance in, you know, the American national conversation. In 1848, there was the first women's rights convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. And Elizabeth was, you know, fired up and captivated by these new ideas, you know, by this idea that actually, you know, a woman could shine in her own right. She didn't just have to reflect the light of her male partner. The fact that a woman, you know, could, you know, have her own opinions. This was actually all new to Elizabeth because she was a product of her time. And prior to this, you know, she had sort of towed the line and she had been that obedient wife and mother. And of course, as she begins to assert herself, Theophilus is horrified. He's horrified that their domestic peace has been shattered. He's horrified that whereas previously Elizabeth would be a silent listener in their marriage, now she wanted to be part of the conversation. His had always been the only voice in the room before, but now she too wanted to speak. And even more horrifyingly, she didn't just want to speak at home over the dinner table. She wanted to speak out in their community, and she would challenge Theophilus on his religious views. And actually, one of the catalysts for her being sent away to the asylum is that she eventually becomes so confident in her own beliefs and wants to reject what was a very sort of hellfire and damnation creed that her husband preached. She wanted to reject that. Elizabeth was an incredibly religious woman. She felt she had her own relationship with God. It didn't need to go through her husband. And for her, God was love. She saw the best in everyone. Whereas Theophilus's creed was about the negativity. Everyone was damned unless they found his God. And so Elizabeth leaves his church, which is obviously such a public rejection of him as a husband, as a spiritual leader. And he is frankly worried about his position in the community, about the impact this might have on his own congregation. And so this is partly why she gets sent away, and it's certainly one of the driving catalysts. And Elizabeth says to him, why do you try to destroy my character instead of debating with me about my opinions? But the thing is, she was a brilliant woman. She's described as having a rare command of language, a fine mind, a brilliant imagination, and irresistible magnetism. This is how she's described by people who know her at the time. And so he just couldn't compete. And he was worried that this influential woman would also take his congregation with her as she leaves, as she rejects him. And that's partly why she ends up in the asylum. She's committed, as the doctors record it, for excessive application of body and mind, or as she put it, I've been placed here by my husband for thinking.
So you touched on this, and we actually have a question that kind of touches on this as well, which is, the question is, what part did religion play in institutionalization of women? You do a great job in the book, I think, of showing how one set of beliefs can be used on both sides, right? They basically are sharing this. They share the same religion, they share the same, the Bible, but she ends up looking at it in a very different way than he looks at it, and it seems like society and and also the way this is kind of, it's hard to overlook how this is overlapping the Civil War, and then you've got the abolitionists looking, they're very much devout Christians. You think of even someone like John Brown and some of those people very much using the tools of the Bible to reinforce those beliefs. And then you of course have the South, the Confederacy, using it for the same purpose. And talk about that duality.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there is a duality, and it's one of those things, isn't it? People can use the same text and absolutely twist it to what they want to see. Elizabeth actually voiced admiration for John Brown. She herself was an abolitionist. That's what she believed. And again, one of the problems in their marriage and in this sort of split that she has with her husband, actually, her husband was an abolitionist as well. He actually in his hometown of Shelburne, Massachusetts, there was one time he couldn't preach, and he hired an African-American to preach for him in his absence. So he actually supported abolition as well. But what happened in the church is his church was given some money to build a new church building, and the money came with strings attached. They said you have to switch to the old school Presbyterian creed, which at that time was ambivalent about abolition. It sat firmly on the fence. There were lots of these sort of General Assembly meetings where they voted on it, they discussed it, because obviously slavery was the hot topic in America at that time. But the old school decided they didn't want to pronounce on the subject. They were very hands-off. They didn't want to use the Bible actually to go either way. They thought this is too much of a political hot potato. And the money came with strings attached because there was this very rich man called Cyrus McCormick, and he believed if he could suppress talk of abolition, from the pulpit, for example, that things might settle down, that there would be no civil war. And this is why he gave money so that Theophilus could build a church. And Theophilus, in what is something you can really, Elizabeth, I think, was ashamed of him because he didn't voice his support for abolition. He meekly took the money, he towed the line, and Elizabeth would challenge him and say, we need to use our voices, we are abolitionists, we need to tell these people, you can't sit on the fence, you have to speak out about these things. But Theophilus took the money, basically, he was actually in debt, and he took the money and preferred to do that rather than stand up for his own beliefs, whereas Elizabeth is someone who does stand up for her own beliefs, and that's something to admire her for, and that's ultimately why she left the church as well.
I think one of the things that is most important or difficult when writing history is to find ways to contemporize it and make it seem like people today could understand it, draw parallels. So we have to talk about Britney Spears for a second.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So yesterday, Britney Spears goes to court or gives a statement about a conservatorship. Now, if people don't know what a conservatorship is, this is basically in 2007, Britney Spears had a moment of mental health crisis and was basically placed into a legal conservatorship for her father, who basically now, in many ways, legally especially, kind of owns her and all of her, decisions, her monetary decisions, even in some ways her bodily decisions. She's talking about having an IUD placed and not being able to remove it. It's 2021. This sounds quite familiar. Did you see parallels when you heard that story?
Absolutely, I did. Yes. As you say, it's a woman who is now completely legally in the control of a male paternal figure. And that's exactly what happens to Elizabeth. That was the situation for all married women in America at that time, a law known as coverture, which meant that it said the husband and the wife are one, and that one is the husband. And it meant married women had no rights to property, the custody of their children, their own earnings, their liberty, thus Elizabeth being sent away. Something that really struck me about what Britney was saying was the way she talked about, all those positive Instagram posts she'd had to do, that she had to sort of say that she was happy, and she was hoping that would perhaps lead to freedom. She faked it till she made it, was the sort of phrase that she used. And that really struck me, because when Elizabeth is in the asylum, the treatment that she's experiencing from the doctors, she calls it a subduing treatment. And the idea was that these disobedient women, these unnatural women, these eccentric women, had to learn how to behave, how to become placid, docile, timid, smiling, happy women who would not speak out angrily as Britney did yesterday. They were supposed to be these, I talk about them as mute marionettes in the book, this sort of these cutout dolls. Elizabeth writes of how she's been sent to the asylum to be broken in. And actually, for the women in the asylum, the only way out is to toe the line, to become these obedient women. That's how you get sent home. And it really struck me, that parallel that Britney felt, and there was a quote that a mental patient actually from the 20th century wrote in some of my research. She said, if you're uncooperative, you're crazy. And that, I think, still resonates today as well. And I want to make the point, you've raised Britney, which is obviously all over the news today. What inspired me to write the book was actually the Me Too movement from 2017, because what struck me about that was that finally, as happened to Britney yesterday, she was listened to, she was believed. That was, for me, what the Me Too movement was astonishingly about. Finally people are listening. And the genesis of the book was, I was thinking, well, why hasn't this happened before? How have women been silenced in the past? And I realized, for centuries, whenever women have used our voices, we've been liable to be called crazy. Our mental health has been wielded as a weapon against us to undermine us, discredit us, control us. And that's what I wanted to write about. But as I say, I'm a storyteller, so I didn't want to write a polemic. I wanted to find one woman's story in history through which I could explore those issues, hopefully make them resonate with a modern reader, because they do still resonate today, but to do it through the prism of this one woman's experiences. And after a lot of searching, Elizabeth Packard was the woman that I found. And I think her story really does resonate, not only about Britney, not only about the Me Too movement, but also if you think of our political, female leaders, Nancy Pelosi, Vice President Kamala Harris, they've both been called mad women. Trump tweeted about Nancy Pelosi, there's something wrong with her upstairs. So for me, it's just, these issues are absolutely still resonating today and are still important to think about and address.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up politics, because it's so obvious when you see things like when Hillary Clinton was running. You remember there was this famous ad about, what would she do at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the morning? And it was all these kind of subtle things about decision making, and is she going to be emotional when all these coded words, like emotional, or, and it's all, I guess, in some ways, like it's all tied to hormonal, menstruation, all these kind of things. There are these under the radar things people don't say, but you feel like there's going to be a moment where she will be unstable and not be able to make a decision. And in some ways, probably that's almost like a sub-level of misogyny that's at a level far beyond equal pay. It's a psychological thing that probably is so far back and embedded in our minds that we don't really know where it began. And this, of course, was what was happening then too.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, it kind of under the radar now, although as you say, there are those sort of code words that are completely hinting at it. In Elizabeth's time, actually, it was overt. And I think that was, a bit like you said at the top of the presentation, as I went into my research for this book, For the Woman They Could Not Silence, I knew that there was misogyny in psychology. I knew I was going to find that. But actually, even I was shocked at what I uncovered, at the way a woman's menstrual cycle, was seen as this cause of her madness. Elizabeth's menstrual cycle is noted on her admittance form. The women's menstrual cycles were monitored within the asylum because it was so closely linked. And what really shocked me was the treatments that were then, devised in the 19th century to treat female insanity, because they thought that it originated from women's sexual organs. A lot of the treatments focused on those too, so that, a woman, who was suspected of having a mental health issue would have a vaginal examination with a speculum. Some of the treatments, completely centered on the genitals would be things like having leeches applied to women's genitals, having iced water applied, caustics. And for me, the most shocking thing that I read about was the surgery that they did to try to calm the women down. There was a doctor called Dr. Baker Brown, who was the most famous advocate of this treatment, and it was a clitoridectomy. They literally cut off women's clitorises for emotional disorder. And Baker Brown claimed a 70% success rate. And the process in itself is shocking. Reading his notes, he would say, and I apologize if this is too much for anyone, but he said, I would either use the scissors or the knife. I always preferred the scissors. And you read his case notes, and the people on whom he's operating are, for example, a 20-year-old woman whose only so-called symptom of madness was that she liked to engage in serious reading. Another patient was a 30-year-old woman who had expressed dislike for the society of her husband. These were women who, just weren't towing the line, basically. He advocated the treatment if there was marital discord. And he wrote, in satisfaction, that his patients after the operation became in every respect a good wife. And so, as you say, all of that is just completely overt in Elizabeth's time, and was for me one of the most shocking, jaw-dropping things about my research for the book.
Yeah, and you think about things like that, I think we hear about things like that and we so tie it into things like female genital mutilation that happens in the Middle East in certain countries, and we think that that could never happen here, and that's always usually a bad place to start, if you don't know the history of a thing. I'm curious, can you talk about, I was kind of thinking back when reading this about the way in media, especially, that asylums and mental institutions are, they've been called so many different things over the years, have been portrayed. And I think there's two different versions. One is kind of almost like this dungeon, this depravity, and the people working there, and the kind of the one flew over the cuckoo's nest idea. And then the idea even behind that if you were to go into this place sane, the place itself could make you insane just because of what you're around. What was the condition like in this specific place? And talk about the kind of collective impact it did have on her mental state, being surrounded by people who really did have some problems, because it's not as if everyone in there was like her. There are people who actually do need some treatment and some of these things. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, this, I have to say, was actually one of the many reasons I was really interested to tell this story, because I've long had a fascination, as I think a lot of people had, with these asylums. You mentioned One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I am a huge Sylvia Plath fan, so the bell jar had always piqued my interest in this. Going further back, the yellow wallpaper. I think there's long been this sort of fascination, and it was something I was really excited to delve into in my research. I would say the answer is that there's almost two sides to the institution that Elizabeth ends up in, the Illinois State Hospital. And she writes of the beautiful grounds that, this almost sort of palatial, stately home type hospital is in. She says it's there to make a passerby think it's a heaven instead of a hell. And Elizabeth has these dual experiences. When she first arrives, it is more like a heaven. Actually, the ward that she's first sent to is nothing like what you've just described. I read in the research how, the women on 7th ward would dine at tables that were covered in cloth. There would be glass, there would be china. It's all very civilized. There's, paintings on the walls. There's a library where she can borrow books. There are rugs on the floor. It is, as an asylum should be, the etymology of the word, that it is a sanctuary. And that's how it is for Elizabeth, not least because she's just been putting up with her husband attacking her day in and day out. Now, finally, actually, in some ways, she's free from him and, enjoys what the asylum can offer. But what happens to Elizabeth is she talks to the other women that she's with. She realizes that, this subduing treatment is how she's supposed to get out. She can only get out if she submits to her husband's will. And so Elizabeth fights back. The book actually is about her journey to find her unsilenceable voice. So she does go on a journey in the book. She starts as this housewife, almost too scared to speak up. She writes, I felt, as though nothing I said was worth saying or hearing. And it's the journey of her actually becoming a stronger woman. And she becomes an advocate for her sisters in the asylum, because even though the first ward she's sent to is not the dungeon we imagine, actually there is still cruelty. The women are not, as I say, they're supposed to become these cutout dolls. They're supposed to become the Britney Spears of her Instagram post, happy, smiling, never mourning the fact that they miss their children, never getting angry at the husbands that have sent them there. They're supposed to become these placid, timid, docile women to be sent on. And they're therefore criticized and punished if they cry, if they show any kind of emotional reaction to the fact that they've lost their liberty and they're in this situation. And so Elizabeth speaks up for them, but doing so gets her into trouble. And then she is sent to the other side of the asylum, to the hell of the asylum. And that is, as we would imagine, the degradation, the filth, patients who are violent, who do attack Elizabeth. She has no safety, no sanctuary. But what Elizabeth does, and again, this is part of her story, And she does fear for her sanity. You know, you talked about, you know, an asylum being this place where you're sane when you're sent there, but you become insane through the process. Elizabeth does fear that because she's robbed of her writing privileges, for example. She does actually manage to keep a secret journal, but she's forbidden for using her voice, from writing, for having any friendships with the other women. You know, having become the advocate for her sisterhood, she's forbidden from making any relationships with other women because they're deemed too mischievous. You know, she's too persuasive a person, she's too inspiring a person, and she does fear for her sanity, that it's, you know, it's going to be lost from her. But how she survives is she looks around this dungeon, at the filth, the degradation, these, you know, disturbed patients who need help, and she sees the humanity in them, and she thinks, I can help these people. And the way she survives the asylum is to help other people. She sort of talks about, you know, the only way she can carry her burden is to carry the burdens of others. And so she transforms the wards that she's on. She soaps down the patient, she scrubs the walls that are coated in excrement, and again, she inspires the patients as well. And this is just part of her journey. She is this incredibly inspirational woman, who really fights for other people, and she continues that throughout her whole life.
Yeah, and I think it's a good place to remind people that to find out what happens, you're going to have to read this book. And the easiest way to do that is to get a copy. And we're going to make it really easy for you right here. We're going to put a link here in the chat, and you can get a copy and find out the kind of amazing journey. We've barely touched on this, the amazing journey that this woman goes on, and also her legacy beyond that and all the work that she did. I think that is worth saving for the reader to kind of take that journey. I'm curious, you know, this, you know, talked about 1860. So we're about 70 years out from the advent and popularization of lobotomies. We are not quite there in terms of the pharmacological revolution, which would really have a huge impact on basically turning people into vegetables for the most part if they were behaving in a certain way. So she kind of missed some of those things. If those tools had been around, though, there's no doubt to me that a lot of these women would have been basically, you know, turned into, you know, vegetables.
Yes, completely. And one, you know, note as you raise the thing, as I was reading about the drug treatments that did exist in that time, and a lot of them were poisonous, frankly, you know, mercury-based medicines, hemlock, for example. And one thing they did use on the patients was chloroform and ether. And you know, I've read in the medical journals that the doctors advocated using these on women, on boisterous women in particular. And the doctors said that they would use these drugs to quiet women, not only temporarily, but permanently. So there may not have been the drugs that you're describing, but some doctors did still use these other drugs to knock women out so that they wouldn't cause trouble anymore.
Yeah. You know, I think there was that whole series of shirts, that nasty woman. You remember those shirts? I think you should do a boisterous woman shirt.
Yeah, good idea.
There's so many like words in here that would sound so timid, but they were so dangerous. You know, these kind of like hysteria, boisterous, all these words that sound like they're not as bad as they are, but they mean something else. So we have a question from Facebook, and the question touches on the origins of the story. And one thing we haven't talked about was, of course, I had not heard of this story before. Where did you hear of this story? How did this even get on your radar?
Well, as I say, I'd sort of decided I wanted to write about women and madness and the way that women had been controlled in that way. And to be honest, I literally went looking for Elizabeth, and I was chatting with one of my friends about this the other day, and they said what they found really interesting is that I knew I would find a woman. You know, I didn't know when I started looking that I would end up writing about the mid-19th century. And actually, you mentioned lobotomies and, you know, the drug treatment, the electric shock treatments as well from that later era. A lot of my early research actually focused on that. You know, having written the Radium Girls, which has so much sort of medical horror in it, I spent a lot of time actually looking at patients who had lobotomies, which included women who had postnatal depression and things like that. So, you know, a lot of my early research was focused on that. But the problem with it was that all the stories I found had awful, terrible endings, because there was no upside.
Right.
Was it. But as you can imagine from the book being called The Woman They Could Not Silence, Elizabeth's story was different. And how I found her was literally internet searches, women, madness, lunacy, science of the age, just trying to find a story. I probably even typed in sane woman locked up in an asylum, to be honest. And I found Elizabeth in a random University of Wisconsin essay that was posted online, was reading my way through it, and 4 pages in, there was a single paragraph that made reference to Elizabeth Packard. And I thought, she sounds interesting. And so I dug deeper into her story. And as I did so, very quickly realized she is the one, the woman that I want to write about next. Partly because what a woman she is. I've described some of the attributes, as described by people who knew her. She did have this incredible spirit. She goes on this phenomenal journey, and I love that journey of her finding her voice. She writes of being in the asylum. In my case, this woman crushing machinery works the wrong way. The true woman shines brighter and brighter instead of being strangled. The fact she wrote as well, a gift for me to be able to quote her in my books. But above all else, what I loved as a storyteller is the compelling drama of her story. So you've got the innate drama and horror and injustice of a sane woman being locked up. It, completed that aspiration I had of wanting to look at how women, assertive women, had been silenced. But it also has courtroom drama in it. It's got that fight against injustice and empowering women at its heart. It's got the gothic horror that I was interested in, of going inside those insane asylums, doing that research into what it was really like, what the furnishings were like, what the treatments were like, being able to describe that world for the reader. So as I say, once I read her name and started looking into her story, it really seemed a sort of match made in heaven that this was a story I could tell.
So you've become quite the chronicler of American history. And, obviously I'm going to shock people and say, you may hear in Kate's voice that she's not American, just letting you know, big shock. But what benefit do you see kind of from an outside looking in perspective? Are you able to kind of think, I think there is a kind of a unique perspective when you can kind of a little bit be outside the system and see things from a new way. Do you feel that when you're looking at these stories?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think, people often say to me, how almost ashamed actually they feel that they never knew the story of the Radium Girls, for example. Now, it was actually through an American's play that I discovered it. So it's not really a British woman finding it. I found it through an American. So I don't know. I mean, I think my sort of greater worry is, for example, when I found Elizabeth, I had to email my editor and say, does anyone know Elizabeth Packard? For all I knew, she was taught in every single history class across America. And just because I didn't know her name, it didn't mean she wasn't really well known already. So I think there are benefits and probably disadvantages as well to being a Brit looking at American history.
So obviously the book is just out. This last year has been very strange. I was so glad you were able to come visit us before all this stuff happened.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing a lot of the research was done a while back. Were you writing the book still during some of the early part of the pandemic? Was it good to have some project underway and have something to work on?
I delivered the book on the 4th of March, 2020.
Oh, wow.
So it was just as it was beginning to take over America and the UK. So in some ways, actually, it was really frustrating timing for me, because I'd already been locked down, because I'd been locked down to hit my deadline. I hadn't been seeing any friends. I was like, right, when the book's over, that's when the cocktails, the meals out, it's all going to happen there.
Creative quarantine had already happened. Yeah,
exactly. So actually, I mean, it's really strange. I've sort of been locked down since about October 2019, because that's when I really got my head down on the book. And so it was awful timing in that regard. but yeah, I guess, all the editing happened in lockdown, and it was kind of strange in a way, because then my husband was at home with me because he was working from home because of the pandemic. I think he found it quite an eye-opener that I wasn't necessarily always at my desk at 9 a.m, that I would sort of faff about as people that work from home often do. I'd only really sort of get into it, in the afternoon. So I think he found that a bit of an eye-opener.
You were already a pro at this working from home thing. So I'm curious, you mentioned earlier, you never sit down and you're not trying to write a polemic and do that. Obviously, these are creative nonfiction, and they do read with ease, kind of novelistic ease, which is what you're going for. But then again, you look at these books, and of course, you obviously have an interest. You're telling stories of women that have been forgotten. Is that something you think you'll continue doing, and looking for the stories of these women throughout history and telling unknown tales, or tales that you feel like need more of a spotlight shined on them?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think I do feel drawn to female stories. That's not to say that I wouldn't write about a man in future, or about an issue that affects men and women equally. But yes, as a woman, that is, I do feel passionate about telling female stories. And how I found the Radium Girls, at the very, very initial starting point, was I was directing a play, and I Googled great plays for women, because as a female director of the production, I wanted a play with women at the heart of the story. So that has always driven me as a person creatively, whether it's in theatre or in books. So yeah, I suspect it's something that will continue to drive me, but that's not to rule out any other stories as well.
It's even since we talked, and the Radium Girls had been out for a little bit by the time we first met, but it seems like it just kind of keeps going, and the readership keeps growing, and they've kind of become like these folk heroes, like it's exciting. I see a lot of younger women reading the book, and kind of getting to know that. It seems like it really crosses generations. Yeah, I'm just curious now, a couple of years after we last spoke, what, the momentum of that book kind of keeps going and going. Are you constantly surprised by that?
Constantly. I mean, I still have to pinch myself that all of the success that happened with that book happened because, there's something beautiful about it, actually, because I didn't write it expecting it would be a success. I wrote it just because it was a book that I wanted to read. It was that classic thing, write the book you want to read. It didn't exist. I felt it should, that the women deserve this book. And so, yeah, my mind is continuously blown by the fact that so many people have engaged with the story. And I love that, every week I get emails from readers telling me how much the women mean to them. And that is so special and wonderful. And yeah, I just feel totally blessed to have gone on that journey with the Radium Girls, and above all else, what's amazing is that they're being remembered and honoured, and that is more than I could ask. It's what I hoped for, and it just feels amazing that people know their names.
One of the things I enjoyed speaking with you about, I don't even know if this was something we did on stage when we were talking last time, but you've written so much stuff, and you've ghostwritten, and you've done all kinds of projects. Now, of course, you've, I think, been afforded the success to kind of focus on the projects you specifically want to focus on, not taking kind of jobs because you need the writing job. But is there anything you miss about those kind of opportunities? Do you miss? I don't know. I mean, you wrote, is it ghost wrote? Is that how we would say it? Ghost wrote, maybe, several books. And that had it's an interesting idea, right? You're trying to capture the voice of someone else and kind of take these things on, or do you miss anything about that period of your career? Or are you like, no, forget that. I'm totally down with just doing my own special things now?
No, I would say, I mean, I loved being a ghostwriter, and I would never rule out not ghostwriting again. I did really enjoy it. Again, there's a privilege in being entrusted to tell someone's story, and I've definitely brought that ethos into my history books, this sort of sense of responsibility to tell someone's story, to try and tell it as powerfully as possible so that people understand what these women usually went through. What I especially loved about ghostwriting is that it almost enabled me to use my acting and theatrical background, because you obviously have to because you're becoming that person as you're writing in their first person and trying to get into their thoughts and mind. So I love that aspect of being a ghostwriter. So I would say never that I wouldn't go back to it. The freedom obviously is amazing, but I would say there is also pressure. Like I never really know what I'm going to write next. And I do feel, you know, I felt enormous pressure in choosing Elizabeth's story. You know, what was I going to write after the Radium Girls, which was such a serendipitous project and such a passionate project for me. I did feel the pressure to come up with another idea that I hoped readers would come with me on the journey, and I hope they will. I think there's a lot in Elizabeth's story that I think people who loved the Radium Girls, I think, you know, there's a lot in it that I hope they will enjoy as well. And I now need to, having published Elizabeth's story, I now need to think what the next book is going to be, and I don't yet know what that's going to be.
Well, that's a great point, because, you know, if that book, if Radium Girls had been your very first book and had hit with that level of success, it may have been kind of paralyzing to you in a way. But, you know, and having done it a few times and kind of, you've been to that rodeo many times before, you kind of knew how to get back on the bike and do the stuff you need to do. So I actually, we did an event just a few days ago about Ralph Ellison and his wonderful novel Invisible Man, and how it was huge success, but he never published another book for the 50 years after that. And you know, it just kind of put him in a strange place, but it seems like this was just the perfect timing for you, all of this stuff. I want to say one more time, everybody who's watching, if you do not have this book, you need to change your life and get it and add this to your stack of to be read. The Woman They Could Not Silence. If you enjoyed Radium Girls, or if you enjoy a well-told story, which who among us does not, this will be a special treat for you. And I think it's going to be the kind of thing you're going to want to talk to your friends about. And this is kind of a perfect book club book. I think this is like, sit around with a glass of wine and talk about what the hell was going on in the 1860s, and how in some ways a lot of the things that were happening then are happening now. Kate, this has been just a blast. Thank you so much for staying up late. I hope you get some rest, and I hope next time we get to do this in person again.
Oh, I really hope so. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm so grateful for your support. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Get vaccinated. And we hope to see you guys in person very soon this summer. Take care. Bye-bye.